Hello, this is Dennis Hazel. Today's video is entitled The History of the Development of Forest Product Markets and Their Impacts. The main points we want to cover are to look at the history of the use of forest products and the impacts that use has had on our forest, talk specifically and with some repetition from the last video about use first by Native Americans and then by Europeans. I want to then talk about the Industrial Revolution, as this was sort of a big turning point in market development. Then talk about the emergence of the modern paper industry and the housing industry, and ultimately the emergence of bioenergy. And in a separate video, then we will talk about current market trends. What do we mean by the term forest products anyway? Well, if you ask folks, what are forest products? Give some examples. Usually paper is the first thing that's mentioned, and then they'll mention solid wood products, housing, picnic tables, decks, things made out of lumber. But in the larger sense, forest products are any materials or uses provided to mankind by forest. And even today, the diversity of products, uses, and values provided by forest can be seen in survey results about why landowners own their forest land. So from surveys, and this is from the National Woodland Owner Survey, here are the reasons why landowners say they own forest land. And these are given as this bar graph in percentages. And the number one reason cited was legacy, leaving a legacy for children or others. And then one that's been high on surveys where this kind of question has been asked over the decades is wildlife, an investment, enjoying nature, providing clean water, enjoyment of beauty, providing some privacy, having a home on the land is often cited, and there is timber way down on the list. So although we tend to think about forest land as producing timber and landowners as being interested in growing and selling timber, it turns out it's further down the list. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 on this list on the National Woodland Owner Survey from 2011 to 2013. But an important thing to keep in mind, and keep in mind throughout this semester, is that about 3/4 of landowners say they require some income from their land to achieve these other interests that may be more important than timber management. And again, we'll talk about Eastern Native Americans and forest as we did in the previous video. What kind of use did they make of forest? First, food. The forest provided deer, fish, small game. We talked about it having been an agrarian society, provided things like corn, squash, and fruit. And wood material for the house frames, for tools, tool handles, and boats. And fuels for cooking and heating, of course, was very important. And as we noted before, both wildlife range and cleared land for agriculture were needed. Prescribed fire was a very important tool. What effects did the native peoples have on our forests? It created diversity of the forest due to the human effects and the lightning-induced fires. And we had fire-tolerant forests. So longleaf pine in parts of the state, especially the coastal plain, and oak forest. Oak were mixed in with the longleaf in the coastal plain, and a great part of the Piedmont because oaks are moderately tolerant to fire. And we had noted before there was the large prairie and savanna mixture in the central and western Piedmont, which also had to do with fire. We showed you in the previous video a very early map of North Carolina in which the Grand Savanne was delineated or named. And here's a later map from 1718 where you can see the word Grand Sabine. And again, at one time it went all the way from southern Virginia down to the Atlanta area. Then chronologically came the arrival of the European. We've noted before the demise of the Native American population due to disease, which started the end of the use of fire. With that, the development of understory, midstory, and eventual replacement of pines with hardwoods, resulting in the cathedral-like image many think always existed. But with that, with the arrival of the Europeans, came new markets and land clearing. So let's talk about some of the early timber markets. The very first lumber exports to Europe from North American forests occurred only 1 year after the Mayflower landed in Massachusetts. So our export industry, from forest export industry, began very early. The Europeans, of course, also practiced agriculture, but they had livestock, which was different than the Native Americans had. Thus, rails for fencing became a major use of wood. And then material for ships: masts, oak planks, cedar timbers, pitch and tar, which came from longleaf in the southeastern U.S., and material for houses and barns dominated timber markets for many years. Fuel wood use was huge and important, averaging 4.5 cords per person per year. You often hear firewood today still referred to in cords. The land clearing was the biggest effect of this time. Between 1850 and 1910, forests were being cleared in North Carolina for agriculture at the rate of 13.5 square miles per day. About 190 million acres were cleared during this period. And that's in the U.S., not just North Carolina. But although forests were being converted to agriculture, timber cleared supported developing markets. And remember, logging is not forestry, and forestry did not show up as a profession in the U.S. until the early 1900s. And by the way, I correct myself, the 13.5 square miles was for the U.S., not North Carolina. And some photos of some of the markets that became enormous. Shipping, fencing, and you look at the fencing and get some idea that there must have been a lot of wood that was used for livestock fencing by a developing nation. And it turned out it was true. And then, of course, firewood or fuel wood. The timber markets, as we're learning, have existed since the earliest colonial days. So we've had timber markets, but change is not something new. It's always existed and always will. So this is my presentation of what I think the timber markets were as timelines for the different markets. And I'm not sure I have this exactly correct. I've come as close as I think I can from what I've been able to glean. So we'll talk about, and this is from 1600 to today. So we see the period ship mass up through the late 1800s when steel began to replace wood for ships. Then the naval store industry was pretty much concurrent with the shipping industry, and we'll talk more about naval stores, but this is tar and pitch and things that were derived from longleaf pine that were used to seal ships. Then construction, here's the first one that we see that after starting continues until today, construction material. An interesting one, plank roads. Fairly short period here, interesting and significant for a while. Furniture is the second of the gross types of market that started early before 1700 and continues into this day, and of course, as you would expect, corresponds with construction. Then the pulp and paper industry. A relative latecomer, if you're looking at the scale all the way back to 1600, late 1800s basically, and continues to today, as does poles and piling. So this is utility poles, piers, things like that. It's a very premium product. Plywood, material made by peeling with large knives veneer from very high quality logs, gluing them in layers and creating material called plywood. There's hardwood plywood and pine plywood. Pallets for shipping about the same time. And then we get into a couple of the newest products. OSB stands for oriented strand board. It's for construction underneath floors or roof decks. It's a material that can use low quality trees where flakes are basically stripped from the tree boles and glued together into panels that have largely replaced plywood with a much lower. The plywood comes from very high quality material. Oriented strand board OSB from low. Then chip and saw. That's a fairly new one. Chip and saw material comes from usually pine plantation thinnings where the trees are a little larger and better quality than pulpwood. I apologize for the bit of a blip in the recording. We happened to have ambulances and police going by the building with sirens on. I'm sure the microphone was picking up a lot of that. So my apologies. So back to chip and saw. Chip and saw, as I said, is a product that comes from any kind of pine thinning, but especially plantation thinning, and it's a larger diameter and straighter form than pulpwood often is, and they're able, with a chip and head rig and a mill, are able to cut out of the center of the tree dimension lumber, usually 2x4s. Then the area of the wood outside of that, but inside the bark, gets chipped for paper, which tends to be a fairly low value product that comes from the forest. Landowners don't make so much for pulpwood, whereas they make a lot more money when a tree is sold for saw timber. Chip and saw from thinnings is a hybrid product of pulpwood and lumber, so it tends to be intermediate in value to a landowner between pulpwood and saw timber. Then comes energy wood. Use of wood for energy is thought by many people to be a new use of wood, a new product. When you look, you see that it's not. And the reason for that is because forest industry has used wood for years to energize sawmills, paper mills, and other manufacturing plants. Of course, we've had later use of it for displacing coal and things like that we'll talk about. And this is really a type of energy use that is making wood pellets for fuel, and you'll see it's a fairly recent and of great interest to landowners product. And then last we'll talk about cross-laminated timber is recent. So we'll go back now to some of those that I described in the timeline. We'll talk about naval stores. It's produced from longleaf pine, where pitch was collected from wounds called cat faces. I mentioned in the previous video some remnant longleafs on the woodland associated with the farm, University Farm on Lake Wheeler Road. Also in those stands are some old stumps with longleaf stumps with cat faces on them. The pitch that was gathered was refined into tar, turpentine, and other products. Combined with lumbering and the elimination of fire, resulted in the reduction of longleaf forest of the South to a small fraction of pre-colonial. Because with the cessation of fire, ended longleaf regeneration, which does require use of fire, especially for natural regeneration. And these are some pictures you can look at for a minute or so here that are from this naval store industry, showing the barrels at a wharf to be loaded on the ship, barrels from a tar refinery, turpentine refinery being loaded onto wagons, the longleaf in the forest, and cat faces being made by stripping away the bark, the cambium in longleaf pine. It's another photo showing, I guess, probably renewing the wound and showing how extensive it was. Look at all the barrels here. Cat faces in this picture with the cups into which the pitch was drained. A drawing showing workers in the forest. And we'll move on, but very large-scale industry. Lumber for ships, we mentioned. Masts, white pine, that especially came from the more northern states. White oak for ship timbers and planking. Cedars, chestnut, black oaks were well suited for underwater portions. And Atlantic white cedar in eastern North Carolina was very popular, especially for smaller boats and ships. And we tend to not think of how large the shipping industry was. And this is a picture that was taken late in the wooden tall ships era, when there began to be metal hull ships with boilers that began to displace. A nice photo giving you some idea how much wood it must have taken to develop the shipping industry that was out there. Now we'll talk about lumber for construction. Pine and poplar were often used for log buildings, as they are still today, for a log cabin or log home. But for lumber as opposed to logs, almost all types of species have been used, but over the centuries, southern yellow pine has been preferred. What is southern yellow pine? Our most common southern yellow pines that are used for lumber are in North Carolina are loblolly pine, longleaf pine, shortleaf pine in the western Piedmont, in mountains. And these are species that tend to have the yellowish wood to them. There are other southern yellow pines that are not extensively used for lumber that you'd have in the mountains. Table Mountains pine, pitch pine, some of those. But why southern yellow pine? Well, southern yellow pine is easily sawn. It has really great density. It's got a great grain pattern that helps it stay straight after sawing. It's got good strength, moderate longevity, especially heart pine like you'd find in some of the buildings on the hill forest. Good nail ability, whereas hardwoods tended to be used for flooring and cabinetry. Today's construction lumber, again, any southern yellow pine, but primarily loblolly pine, because of the ease of plantation establishment and prolific natural regeneration ability. Some of the other southern yellow pines, such as longleaf, shortleaf pine, tend to not be so fast out of the gate, so to speak, in the early years. So you have to pay more attention to weed control for both species, use of fire for longleaf pine, and excuse me, loblolly is also the fastest growing pine. And loblolly pine, as it turns out, was a species that was very genetically plastic, and the tree breeders were able to change characteristics or traits of loblolly very easily and build faster growth, straighter form, better branch angles, more disease resistant. So it turned out to be also a good species for that. We mentioned we wanted to talk about the Industrial Revolution. Well, the important aspect of the Industrial Revolution from the forestry perspective was because steam engines were adapted for use in factories, riverboat, ships, and railroad, the fuel wood industry really picked up. I started to say a lot of steam. It would have been a poor choice, but it did. So what was the primary energy source prior and during the Industrial Revolution? In the U.S., it was wood, used to power steamboats, locomotives. By the way, we talked about cords earlier, about 4.5 cords per person per year being used for heating and cooking in the U.S. during the early colonial period in the country. Well, that's what a cord looks like. 4 feet of wood by 4 feet by 8 feet stacked. So that's what it looked like. Wood was eventually displaced by coal. And you can look at this graph of different kinds of fuels for energy in the U.S. from the late 1870s through a couple of years ago. And you can see that wood here in this graph increased Industrial Revolution until here when it was surpassed by coal, which continued until it was surpassed by petroleum. We mentioned earlier plank roads, sort of an interesting wood product that came from the forest. It was fairly short-lived. Started in North Carolina in the 1840s and 1850s, and it was almost doomed from the beginning because it came at a time when it ended up competing with much faster railroads that were beginning to be constructed everywhere. And plank roads required toll collection for maintenance. And a lot of people just simply avoided them because not all roads were plank roads, even though they were better. They were expensive to build, expensive to maintain. Many view them, looking back, as a failure, but many consider it provided a momentary but important economic and moral boost to forestry. It's a sign from Fayetteville. Fayetteville was the focal point for 5 plank roads, chartered from 1849 to 1852, the longest being 129 miles to the northwest. So they were significant. So back to impacts on forests through the early 1900s. Land clearing through the 1800s using slash and burn was followed by agriculture, but poor farming practices resulted in severe erosion, especially in the Piedmont Mountains. And with that, as land productivity declined, agricultural abandonment began to take place in the late 1800s and lasted until the mid-1900s. And these are photos of the results of the poor agricultural practices, the erosion that took place, and abandonment of farmland. And you can go to almost any Piedmont site today and see these old gullies that are now forested, and they have forest floors on them, and they sort of look like natural features. But in fact, it's an artifact of man's impact on the forest, well, impact on agriculture, and ultimately impact on forests that were either planted or naturally seceded. So these abandoned fields were planted into pine or became natural pine stands through natural succession, and these stands could then be managed for higher value products, whose markets, as we already saw, began developing in the late 1800s or 1900s, and they included the pulp and paper industry through use of thinnings, chip and saw much later through use of better quality things, poles and pilings, which are one of the highest value markets where they exist for landowners, plow logs for plywood, which is another high value product. But unfortunately, most hardwood stands were high graded. What is high grading? It's a term we'll be using throughout the semester, but it is where the best trees are gleaned, harvested from the forest, and the worst trees, often the smallest trees in diameter, were left. It may be that the least valuable species were left also, as well as the smallest diameter trees of the higher value species. It's called high grading when this is done. Take the best, leave the worst. Maybe 20 years later, 30 years later, another harvest. Take the best, leave the worst. And when that's happened multiple times in the history of a stand, you can end up with a dysgenic stand of trees that's no longer manageable and might not even be interesting to a buyer. That is, it's non-merchantable. Some other common forest products, a recent newcomer, relatively, oriented strand board, or OSB, which is an engineered matte form panel product made of strands, flakes, or wafers sliced from small diameter roundwood logs and bonded with an exterior type binder under heat and pressure. But the important point is it's made from low value and often smaller stems, and that product has displaced a lot of plywood, which tended to be made from high value, larger stems. We mentioned pallets. Where do they come from? Larger diameter, but low value hardwood. So maple, sweet gum, or not so straight oaks ends up as pallet wood. And with this, the end of the video.